Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jamison Cable, and we're going to continue with Dr. Gary Odell, the author of Bluegrass Paradise, Royal Spring, and the Birth of Georgetown, Kentucky.
Well, water supply, of course, is very important for a community. And for many communities in Kentucky, the spring that was the original motivation for settling that community, as these towns grew, it was no longer big enough. Was not capable of supplying the growing populations. And so over time, all of these springs were eventually abandoned, and communities turned to excavating wells, to collecting rainwater in cisterns, building dams and reservoirs, all but Georgetown, because Royal Spring is literally a huge spring. I mean, it's nowhere on the scale of some of the springs in, say, Missouri, in which are literally rivers coming out of the ground, but I mean, it has a pretty substantial flow that could easily support a population of 10 or 15,000 people in a community.
Wow.
And so today, although Georgetown does have a pipeline to Frankfort for supplemental water supply at need, it is the only community in Kentucky that is still served by the same spring that served the pioneer founders.
Wow, that is pretty interesting. Pretty good little piece of history there to say, you know, we're still being provided the same water source that, I mean, that's hundreds of years, you know.
Yeah, to what is 250 years close to. Shy.
Wow. Well, let's talk a little bit about Elijah Craig, because he's a pretty interesting fellow, and got you know, a bit of a section in the book about him, because you know, I found it interesting because the first thing he wanted to build was a school, which is very kind of not common for most of the places around there, or most of these early towns. You know, that wasn't their main objective. Mostly, you get a courthouse and a jail and those sorts of things. But he was an interesting fellow, and he's pretty well known around the state nowadays just for the bourbon and stuff. But a bit more than that to him.
Well, he was quite an entrepreneur. He, in addition to the academy that he founded at Georgetown, he also engaged in quite a few business pursuits of his own. And I think this is one of the things that helped drive the early economy of Georgetown, because others followed suit. I mean, there was Royal Spring, which put out a good flow of water for most of the year, except during occasional droughts. And that was sufficient to turn a mill wheel, to be dammed up and used to power various mill wheels, plus mills on Elkhorn Creek, which is just north of town as well. So he founded a number of enterprises. Fulling Mill, which is essentially where wool is processed into cloth. He had a sawmill. He had a grist mill. He did make whiskey, although whether or not he was the first to manufacture bourbon still remains controversial. And we can talk about that in just a minute. But he received quite a bit of criticism, though, from the religious community for his business pursuits. They thought perhaps that he was maybe paying a little bit too much attention to making money and not enough attention to tending his flock. Now, of course, he was still popular. He had a lot of followers who thought he was an extremely good preacher,
Mm-hmm.
but it did lead to a number of people condemning him for his uh, for his business interests.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the whiskey legend or the bourbon legend, um, I think we're actually going to have to relegate that to the area of myth rather
Mm-hmm.
than fact, because there's no real evidence to support that Elijah Craig actually made the first bourbon. And bourbon wasn't actually defined until late in the 19th century,
Yeah.
as being. Now, bourbon is known for having been acquiring its unique taste by being stored in charred oak barrels. And that charred oak is what gives it its pleasing amber color and its uh, pleasant taste on the palate. And legend has that Elijah Craig first discovered this process because he had some barrels he wanted to use, but they stank of fish. They had been used for storing fish, so he burned them out to kind of char out the fish smell, and then used them to store whiskey, which turned into bourbon over time.
Mm-hmm.
Or that he had some other barrels that had been in a fire in a barn, I think it was, and he used those, with the same outcome. Now, the problem with this is that the term bourbon was applied to whiskey basically that was made in the region of bourbon rather than whiskey made by a particular process.
Yeah.
At least during the first 50 or 75 years of its existence. And Georgetown was never in Bourbon County.
Yeah.
Bourbon County was a distinct political entity, quite different from Scott County and Georgetown. Now, the region of Bourbon County was huge. I mean, it went all the
Oh,
way to the
very,
Kentucky,
very
to
large.
the
Yeah.
Ohio River, and covered thousands of square miles. And that was known as Old Bourbon. And the major shipping ports like Maysville and Covington and so on, those were on the Ohio River that were in early days still part of Bourbon County. And so bourbon that was or not bourbon, but whiskey that was manufactured in Kentucky, so much of it was made in Bourbon County
Mm-hmm.
and was shipped out down the Ohio and Mississippi River, and was known as coming from Bourbon County and given the name of bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, exactly who made the first bourbon, we don't know. Now, Bourbon County likes to think that it was Jacob Spears,
Yeah.
who had a distillery in Bourbon County, and the distillery warehouse was made out of hand laid stone. His house was made out of rock as well. I mean, all of that still exists, and he's got a nice spring house on the property. So that's a historic site, and the bourbon folk believe that bourbon was first made by Jacob Spears there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Scott County people want to claim Elijah Craig as the inventor of bourbon. Now, we do know Elijah Craig did make whiskey. He got fined for not paying the taxes on it one time. But he never advertised it. He didn't sell much of his own whiskey, probably
Mm-hmm.
mostly for home consumption or his friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I suppose the debate is still open as to whether Craig made whiskey or not, but I'm thinking probably not likely, to the great disappointment, I'm sure, of Scott Countyans that might be listening to this broadcast or in the book.
Yeah.
However, the legend of Elijah Craig is alive and well as the maker of bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually an Elijah Craig brand of bourbon today that is being advertised as using the same process to make bourbon that Elijah Craig did.
Yeah.
So, kind of taking a little bit of liberty with history, but it's good advertising.
Yeah. Well, which good advertising falls right into Elijah Craig's domain, right?
Yes, exactly. He was a good promoter, a good entrepreneur.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a little bit more. That it sets it up pretty well about how Georgetown, how important the spring was to Georgetown. Nowadays, like we already said, the spring still supplies a lot of water is a big water source for the community. And Georgetown is growing tremendously. If you look at the past, what was it, 30, when Toyota came, obviously that
Hmm.
changed Toyota, changed Georgetown quite a bit. Um,
Late 80s.
yeah, yeah. But nowadays, can you visit the spring? How's that go? What are we looking at currently?
Well, the spring is a city park today. It's known as Royal Spring Park. It's not a very big park. It encompasses about an acre, and it shares the property with the Georgetown Scott County Water Company,
Hmm.
which is on the bank, the west bank of the spring, uh, kind of perched up there, and has its facilities all kind of stretched out along the stream. The spring no longer flows free, but
Hmm.
is instead impounded behind a number of settling basins that allow suspended sediments in the water to settle out.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, it's a nice park. It's got a pavilion. It's got a nice wrought iron fence along the spring branch. There's a monument to the pioneers at McClellan Station just above the spring.
Hmm.
Uh, there's log cabins, pioneer era log cabins that have been brought to the park and relocated and set up. It's been nicely landscaped. It is a nice park, and the city makes good use of it. They have music festivals. They have various sorts of celebrations that take place at Royal Spring Park. The spring itself, I mean, you can see it coming out of the limestone bluff,
Yeah.
flowing into these settling basins, and then, of course, it's taken into the water plant and purified for the use of the inhabitants.
Hmm.
Now, one of the things that Georgetown would very much like to do, and has wanted to do for many years, is to create a replica of McClellan Station on the
Oh
bluff
yeah.
above the spring. But there's just not enough room.
Oh.
Much of the property above the spring is occupied by Kentucky Utilities substation and
Ah.
offices. And it may be that at some future date that Kentucky Utilities will be really willing to relocate their substation. But right
Hmm.
now, the edge of the electrical substation is only 40 feet away from the edge of the spring.
Oh.
So there's
Yeah.
just not room to put anything up there.
Yeah.
But
Hmm.
that remains a long cherished goal for Georgetown to be able to do that.
It, and I guess there's not really any other property close because with Fort Logan, they wanted to put it on the actual location, or what is perceived to be the actual location, but it was on private property, so they had to start building the fort, just a little bit off from where it exactly was. But I mean, it's still it looks, it's a good process, and the fort's going up, and they're probably about halfway done. But is there not any close property like that or anything? Because that would be really cool. I would want to have that to visit and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, I agree. It would be really cool. I think the problem is that the spring itself is so
Mhm.
intimately tied to the history of
Yeah.
the Pioneer Station
Mhm.
that it would really be absurd to put the McClellan Station anywhere other than at Royal Spring.
Yeah. Yeah. That's probably true.
And I think that there's a possibility in the future that the Kentucky utilities may be willing to relocate. It would be a difficult and an expensive proposition, but the city has very good relations with the company,
Mhm.
and this would be such an asset to Georgetown if they could
Oh, yeah.
do this. It would be quite a tourist draw. I mean, look at
Yeah.
all the tourists that come to Fort Harrod or to Boonesboro.
Mhm.
This would be
Yeah.
a great benefit to Scott County.
Yeah. Yeah,
They got horse park nearby is another draw for Scott County.
Hmm.
So a lot of
Yeah.
people could come there and have a good time doing what they call heritage tourism.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be great. I mean, I would be ready to roll as soon as as soon as it open the gates as well. And I mean, the spring would be fun to visit as well, just for that the park aspect.
Hmm.
But you throw in that extra fort, it's a must see or station. It's a must check out. Um,
I was going to say, in an ideal world, it would be nice if the water company itself could be relocated so that the spring could be restored to a natural appearance. But I don't
yeah,
see that happening anytime soon. I mean, it's
no,
the water company needs the water from the spring there, and it just
yeah,
would be very hard for them to relocate to some other place. Very
yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, and then you lose the connection to using the same source for so many years.
Yeah.
Um, so that would be rough.
One thing that we've kind of skipped over is about 150 years of history.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, yeah.
You know, between the founding of Georgetown and the present day Royal Spring
Hmm.
Park. And there's a few things that might be worth mentioning in this regard. First, the park itself had a long and troubled history
Yeah.
because the water supply from Royal Spring was being used to power Georgetown's early industry.
Hmm.
And so, even though that area around Royal Spring was set aside as a town commons, basically a recreation area, the reality of it was that it was occupied by industry. You know,
Hmm.
various mills and other industrial operations. And as the 19th century matured, situation simply got worse because the first water plant was set up next to the spring, and then an ice plant and an electric plant. And they got to squabbling about who had the rights to the water,
Hmm.
and that resulted in a lot of litigation, which eventually was resolved when Georgetown basically bought all the property around the spring and came into possession of the water company itself during the 1940s. But the spring itself was and the run of water, the Royal Spring branch, was pretty unsightly for most of the history of the community until just literally like maybe 30, 40 years ago.
Oh wow.
It was, Georgetown residents would regularly complain about in the paper about the puffing smoke and the cinders and the graffiti on the rocks above the spring, and how
Hmm.
it was an area that just collected trash and garbage, and you had pipes running this way and that way from the various operations using the water. And so over the years, there were various efforts made by the city and by various citizens groups to try to actually turn it into a park, to turn this town commons into a
Hmm.
pleasing green space rather than the grit and grime of an industrial area.
Yeah.
And so this is an effort that progressed over more than a century, from the late 19th century, about the 1880s and 1890s, when the first efforts were made by the city to try to do something about it. In the 1920s, the Women's League took it on as a pet project and got a little bit done. They had horse and graders brought out, horse-drawn graders, to kind of level off the landscape and put in some landscaping and maybe a few benches for people to sit on.
Hmm.
And so they were pretty happy about that. But then the park was neglected, basically allowed to deteriorate. And so the efforts began again, uh, and became a little more serious about, 19, in the 1970s. It sort of coincided with Georgetown's bicentennial and the nation's bicentennial, because if you think about it, Georgetown and the American nation have almost exactly the same
Yeah.
birthday, just separated by a few months, basically. And at that time, the Royal Spring was put on the National Register through the efforts of local historian Ann Bolton Bevins.
Hmm.
and there was a much more serious effort made to try to transform it into a park. And the city authorities, the city government, were a lot more cooperative in trying to make this happen. They brought in various planning companies to try to envision how Royal Spring Park might be developed and tie into the city and its economy. Possible development beyond
Hmm.
the immediate vicinity of the spring, but a variety of like maybe replica mills and things that might be built. They talked about the replica of the fort and actually started collecting logs to build it, and then suddenly it dawned on them there wasn't room to put this place. Even though they got started, on the
Yeah,
plan, it was like not really well thought out at that point.
yeah,
So I think what it took was a real progressive mayor to come in there and do something uh, to make the park come about as a reality.
yeah.
And this was Mayor Tom Prather, who
Hmm.
served 4 terms as mayor of Georgetown. His father had actually, I believe, if I'm remembering it right, had also served as Georgetown mayor, and his grandfather was the head of the water plant for a while.
Okay.
So Tom Prather had quite an interest in Royal Spring. Now he was not a crusader. I mean, he was a politician with a realistic view of what could and could not be done,
Yeah,
and you know the city budget could not allow for just presto. Here's a great park that
yeah,
we're going to create. It's something that had to be developed in stages over a long period of time. And citizens groups such as the Scott County Historical Society and others wanted to see this become a park. And so essentially they would bring a wish list to Mayor Prather, and he would get done what he could get done. One of the first steps that he took was to some of the water company buildings, storage warehouses and so on that were kind of cluttering up the site around the Royal Spring itself. And so those were removed, kind of opening up that area so people could actually drive by and see the spring instead of it being hidden behind, some industrial looking buildings.
yeah.
And as time went on, more improvements were made. The pavilion was built uh, during the now, I have to be careful when I say that because there's actually an area in Georgetown called the Pavilion, which has nothing to do with Royal Spring. So maybe it would be better to call it the picnic shelter.
There you go. Yeah.
That's probably a better term. But there was the World Horse Expo. If I got the right name for it. Sometimes my memory doesn't always get their terminology
That's all
exactly
right.
right. But basically, this World Horse exposition came to Kentucky for the first time ever. The horse park was the only facility in the United States that was big enough to host all of the events. And the horse park being very close to Georgetown, the town leaders thought that, well, this might bring a lot of tourism into Georgetown. So they kind of spruced up the whole city, put in a lot of benches and new signage and tidied up Royal Spring Park as best as they could. Did a little landscaping, built a picnic shelter, uh, did a few other things. Unfortunately, it did not turn out that a lot of tourists came from uh, the horse park to Georgetown because they were too busy attending the equestrian events and had little interest in going afar.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that still was a stimulus to get a lot done there at Royal Spring, and it remains on the city's radar. It doesn't always get the maintenance that it needs to get, and that's partly because of budgetary problems.
Yeah.
But there does not seem any likelihood that in the future it's going to be neglected and slip back into being the sort of wasteland that it was in past ages.
Yeah.
I think it's an asset to Georgetown, and the people and the city government are aware of that.
Well, that's good. Yeah, and that's one thing, and you know it's nice that it has that historical value too, which will help, keep the eyes, keep people's eyes on it. You know, because you
Well,
think of. Go ahead.
I was going to say tourism is one of the biggest industries in Kentucky. It's like, I think I don't have the figures at hand, but I think it's something like a $2 billion industry for our state.
Yeah.
And a lot of what the state has as attractions are, in fact, historic sites.
hmm Yeah.
Places like Boonesboro and Harrodsburg and the William Whitley House and
Yeah.
Whitehall and places like that. These attract a lot of tourists. And so Georgetown, it would be greatly to the benefit of Georgetown to be able to better capitalize upon the history of Royal Spring and McClellan Station, because outside of Georgetown, very few people know about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Well, I
know,
mean, I.
Harrodsburg and Boonesboro are state sites. They have state-supported
Mhm.
websites.
Yep.
And they're very well known across the country.
Yeah, and I mean, I know about obviously, I know a little bit, maybe more of a niche person to know about McClellan Station, and I know about that sort of part of it. But like whenever I first started reading your book, the Royal Springs aspect of it, yeah, it's just another spring at another fort, not getting the overall view of the importance of it, over 200 years.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, that's very true. And you think if they could get a Ford up there or something to kind of bolster or boost the knowledge of it, I guess
Hmm.
or publicity of it would be
Sure,
a great thing to do. Um,
sure. Right now, it does not have the physical reality at the moment to be much of a tourist draw.
mhm.
A tourist comes there, they're going to see water coming out of the hillside and a water plant.
Yeah.
It's a nice little park, but that's really only a benefit to the local inhabitants.
hmm
But if it had a heritage attraction like a fort, that could be quite a big difference.
Oh yeah.
I
Oh
think would
yeah.
pull people in, especially when you consider that given the other forts in the state,
Mhm.
Logan's Fort, Harrodsburg, and Boonesboro, Georgetown is much better connected to the interstate system than any of those locations.
Oh,
It takes
definitely.
less time for people to get there
Yeah.
than any of those others.
Yeah. And that would be great. To have, and then you put a fort up in Louisville, and then you got them all five.
Sure, sure.
uh, but yeah, it's very good, and it's I know there's you know political tape to probably get through there to get the electrical company to cooperate and all that kind of stuff, but that would just be it'd be such a nice thing, and obviously we want to support as much of the local history around the state as we can. Um,
Sure.
um, Anything else?
Well, I was going to say that I think that KU would be more than happy to be able to donate that site or sell that site to Georgetown. Is just the the difficulty and expense of moving that substation is a problem, and that's something that has to be a solution has to be found before KU could realistically do that.
Yeah. And there's not much. I mean, that's kind of one of those things that's out of a lot of people's hands.
Hmm.
More so, the city of Georgetown and KU. It's pretty much between them. I guess you could call them up and say, "Hey, get this done," but there's a certain amount of just logistics that would have to take place. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. Um, well, where can people get this book? Where can people connect to you and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I'm always willing to field inquiries about the history of Royal Spring or basically anything regarding springs in Kentucky. I
Mhm.
had a chapter in another UK press book a few years ago called Springs in the Settlement of Kentucky. It was a book that the press put out called Water in Kentucky.
Yeah.
and that kind of was sort of a driving stimulus for me to finish up the Royal Spring book. Because I had written that. But like I said, I'm always happy to talk to people about springs and about the karst landscape of Kentucky. I can be reached through Morehead State University. My book is being sold by the University Press, either by their website, or the simplest way for most people would probably be to go to Amazon or website or Barnes and Noble, or I have seen it listed by several dozen booksellers across not only the United States, but even in foreign countries it's being sold. It's kind of a thrill for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great thing, and we appreciate University Press sending us a copy and stuff as well. Again, whenever you get that Rockcastle Saltpeter Cave book done, I'm ready to talk some about that. So,
Be happy to.
not to push you to get it done, but well, Dr. Odell, anything else before we go?
No, I think we've gone through and discussed most of the important aspects of this amazing natural resource that Georgetown has.
Yeah, and of course we want to encourage people to go out and get it, and we didn't spoil all the details, so plenty more for you to read and get into. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Odell, for joining us, and thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Been a pleasure.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.